Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with André Sturesson. Hey friends, hope you're having a great day. Are you following me on Instagram and Facebook? Please go to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook, or both for that matter, to get the latest episodes, inspiration, and more. Please take a pause and go there. Also, if you like the episode, please share it with a friend, family member, or somebody else who you think might like it. Welcome back, friends, to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with me, André Sturesson, a science-focused podcast where we explore, learn, and improve our lives together. What role do music play when it comes to exercise? According to new fascinating research, music seems to be one important element of a good workout, making it more enjoyable and can also improve performance. McMaster Stork PhD had done several studies of how music affects exercise and also worked as a strength and conditioning coach at McMaster University, so he's really interested in how exercise affects us. He's also highly interested in getting more people on the exercise bandwagon. Friends, I really hope you enjoy today's interesting episode. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this stuff. I think like the big focus today will be about like music. I know you've done some interesting research about how music can affect exercise enjoyment, and stuff like that. I would just like to start off perhaps by asking you like how music have affected like your own exercise in your life.
Great question. I mean, music, I think a lot of us can relate to music as a part of our lives in some way, shape, or form. I often listen the most to music when I am exercising,
Yeah.
Interestingly enough. I mean, it's also, a subconscious part of our lives too, in the sense that you could be watching a movie and a really intense scene occurs and there's a song playing and you kind of gravitate towards that song later on and not even realize it. Music just plays a role in just different facets of our life. And personally, I enjoy listening to music. I think it's, music's also about context and mood. At certain times, if you're relaxing, you might like to chill out to some slower music. If you're getting ready for a workout or about to play a sporting event, then you might want something a little higher energy to get you going. So yeah, I definitely apply music like that in my life. So
yeah. I think music is one of those things that we as humans we really use a lot in a different contexts, as you said. I mean, we use it in listen to music when it's these perhaps more sentimental moments in life. We use it when we're happy. We use it when we're like want to relax, and of course we also use it when we are exercising to get certain things and to get certain effects, I guess.
Exactly.
It's I know. I talked to Martin Jibala before, and it was when afterwards because I know that music for me has been it's crucial when I exercise. I always listen to kind of it's kind of like fast house music that I listen to, and it's for me it really has a big effect on my exercise when I am at the gym and when I am running and when I'm like on the bicycle. So it's it will be very interesting to learn a little bit more about how it affects us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll touch, once we touch on some of the characteristics of music, we can get into as well genres, as you mentioned there, things like even electronic dance music and where they kind of fall in the category of certain characteristics you look for when you're selecting music, even for exercise.
For sure. All right, so maybe we could get into like how music affects exercise. Like for performance, for example, is there any, or what does this data say about how music affects performance when we're listening to music when we're doing exercise?
Yeah, so I think it'll be best to preface this with kind of generally giving you a sense of how music works and why it's effective.
Sounds
So
great.
yeah, so I'll break it down by looking at generally the intensity of exercise. So there's a lot of research looking at exercise that is performed at lower moderate intensity levels. So this could be, going for a nice and easy jog or a run. And in with this type of exercise, music is predominantly used as what we call a dissociative strategy.
Yeah.
So what this really means is music it acts to distract people from the physical cues that they might be experiencing during exercise, like sore muscles, increased heart rate, sweating, things like that might be perceived negatively.
Yeah.
Music dissociates your attention away from those things and shifts your attention towards some of these seemingly negative elements towards positive elements of the music, such as lyrics, the beat, the rhythm, things like that. And so as a result, a lot of the music research in this realm has shown that music can make exercise more pleasurable, enjoyable, and also make you feel like you're not working as hard. And so with that type of exercise, it seems to be pretty clearly and a pretty good amount of evidence to show that this dissociative strategy can be effective.
Right.
However, when we talk about higher intensity exercise, it's a little more complicated because the exercise is so intense that these physiological or physical cues are really hard to ignore.
Yeah,
and so
can relate to that.
yeah, right. So, exactly. So when you're getting into that realm, what we actually suspect that music to be more impactful needs to be, if anything, a little more associative with the task, rather than distracting you away from the elements of the exercise. We need to motivate you to push through. And so the idea would also play into this idea that music can help shift you into a state of flow. And what I mean by this state of flow is essentially getting you fully focused and immersed in the task at hand. And so music can often help you shift into that ideal optimal zone for performance and put you in a spot mentally or emotionally where you're able to operate or perform in a more optimal way. And generally, when it comes to high intensity exercise, it's particularly important, like I said, to have something more motivational. And in that area of research with high intensity exercise, there's still not as much evidence because, again, it's harder for music to have the same impact at a higher intensity level. But there is evidence to show that it could increase work output and enjoyment as well.
Interesting. So would you say that it seems like it's had a bigger effect when it's exercise that is a little bit less intense?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think there's more room for music to have an impact because you're not cognitively demanded and your attention isn't so focused on those physiological elements of the exercise. Because, if you could think of sprinting all out or pushing yourself as hard as you possibly can,
yeah,
whether music's playing or not, it's going to be hard to really impact that experience, right?
It's really hard also to just shut that out. Like when your heart is pumping as hard as it can, kind of.
Exactly. Or the pain you might experience or whatever it may be. And to come back to your question about the idea of performance enhancing specifically, when we talk about that, it's in the music literature, generally the term is looking at ergogenic effect. So essentially it just means music is enhancing performance by either delaying the onset of fatigue or improving endurance. So, for example, you can persist longer when you're on a run, um, or even increasing work capacity. So, this could be maybe gives you a little edge to push a little bit more weight if you're lifting weights. And another example in the context of some of the research that I have done, we've found that music can enhance power output when individuals are cycling on a cycle ergometer, a stationary bike, and they're pedaling as hard as they can. We found that music can get a little more of that power output out of their cycling performance.
Very interesting. This is just so many interesting stuff here. So what you mentioned a couple of different things here. I think perhaps we could just talk a little bit about what you mentioned about if you listen to music that could help you be able to exercise for longer periods without getting exhausted. Was that what you said, or?
Yeah, so I think when I mentioned some of the research, especially with the more like low to moderate intensity range, there's been studies to show that people can persist a little bit longer in an endurance task when they're listening to music versus not. So those are typically what we call like graded exercise tests, which they progressively continue to pedal as long as they can, for instance, on a bike, until they reach volitional exhaustion. So they can no longer, they feel that they fatigued and they can no longer pedal any longer.
Right. So if you listen to music, then you feel then you were able to pedal longer than when you're not listening to music, basically.
Yes, exactly. That would be the idea for sure.
Like how do you know how big the effects are when it comes to like if in minutes or in I don't know percentages, or do we have an idea of that? Or?
Yeah, it would be difficult to quantify. It really would depend on a specific study.
Yeah.
That might look at, it could be a matter of a few seconds, but usually you can get a decent enough edge that it would be something meaningful when it comes to, if you're training for a competition or something. These things would translate even a few seconds in your time could, if you're going a little bit faster or if you're persisting a bit longer, that could be quite meaningful. So
interesting. But do we have any idea of why that is? I mean, why it seems like music can help us endure longer?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when it comes to the effects music has, there's a host of intricate mechanisms that come to play.
Yeah.
Right, and even more factors. I mean, so when we're talking about music, it's just in general. We're not even bringing exercise into the equation. It's just such a complicated stimulus, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And then when we consider exercise, where people are moving, in addition to this, it adds a whole other level. But yeah, it's really a combination of both psychological and physiological manifestations. Like I mentioned, kind of that idea of a state of flow, but shifting our arousal levels, our physiological and psychological responses that kind of bring us into a more optimal zone for exercise or performance.
For sure.
It involves elements of brain activation, like I mentioned, hormonal and arousal changes. Like I mentioned, attentional focus. So whether it be attention towards more physical cues versus the music, and as well motivational factors. So these things all kind of collectively work together to make music such a powerful stimulus that it is.
Interesting. And you also mentioned that it also could affect when you do resistance training. Like what effects have we seen there?
So I'm less familiar with the research in that realm in terms of strength training and resistance exercise. But to my understanding, there's evidence that music can, for instance, if a study was looking at the number of repetitions until fatigue, an individual might be able to get a couple more reps out when looking at music versus no music. So, for instance, let's say that someone's bench pressing as many reps as they possibly can at a set weight without music, and they can get 10 reps, but if they're listening to music, then maybe they get 12 reps.
Right.
Like I mentioned, I'm not sure off the top some specific studies in that realm, but I'm sure there are ones that do exist for sure.
Yeah, interesting. And then you mentioned like your own studies, which are, I think it's very, very interesting, where you've done, when you used music when you were doing these more intense types of workouts. What could you mention again what you've seen in your studies?
Yeah, sure. And to give you a sense for those studies, so I'll give you an example of one of our more recent studies that I did with a colleague, Kostas Karageorgis, out in the UK at Brunel University. For that study, we actually studied a sample of what we refer to as insufficiently active individuals. So these were young, healthy people, but they were not meeting physical activity guidelines. So
what does that mean? Like, is it like they are under 150%, or are they sedentary, or sorry, 150 minutes per week, or are they sedentary, or?
Exactly. Yeah. So we use the 150 minutes of physical activity per week.
Right.
And so we use that criteria, that those physical activity guidelines. So they were not meeting the minimal guidelines.
Right.
So that was what would deem them to be insufficiently active.
Right. Right.
Part of the reason we were interested in studying that sample for this study is because a lot of the music literature is generally with people who tend to be more active. And so we wanted to hone in on people who are less active. And for that study, what we did was, we carefully studied British music charts, because the sample of our participants were young British people.
Yeah.
What's interesting is actually the process we go through for selecting the music. So we actually came up with 16 different songs that fit our sort of general criteria for music. And then we can get into that a little bit later on. But for this study, we were looking at, certain tempo range, a faster tempo for the high intensity exercise.
Right.
And we had a subsample listening to all these songs and rating the motivational qualities of the music. And then what we did is we picked the 3 songs with the highest motivational ratings according to the parameters we were looking for. And then we used those for the actual study. And we took a sample of 24 insufficiently active adults, 12 men, 12 women. And we asked them to complete a session of what we call high intensity interval training. So essentially high intensity bouts separated by periods of low intensity or recovery. And we had them complete this a 3 by 20 second all out HIIT protocol. So they're pedaling as fast as they can for 20 seconds for each bout.
Right.
We had them complete the exact same protocol 3 different times. In one condition, they were listening to motivational music. Another condition, they were listening to a podcast. And the third condition, they had no audio being played at all. And we looked at what kind of effects this might have. And pretty much what we found was that participants experienced elevated heart rate responses and enhanced peak power output in the session where they listened to music compared to the podcast and no audio control conditions. And then we also found that participants tended to report greater pleasure over the course of the protocol, but they had significantly higher post-exercise enjoyment scores in the music condition compared to the controls.
Interesting. So there's a lot of different stuff here. So the first one is more kind of biological, I guess. So they're actually their heart rate was actually a bit faster when they were listening to the music compared to when they were listening to the podcast or the no music alternative.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and it's really interesting because this plays into a concept that the term is entrainment, and this refers to the tendency of biological rhythms, so heart rate, respiration rate, even brain waves, to align with musical rhythms.
Right.
And yeah, so in other words, there's this innate human tendency to synchronize movement with musical rhythm, which may have played a role in that finding in terms of heart rate responses, because the music was fast tempo,
Yeah.
and that may have contributed to elevating heart rates.
What is that concept called again? Entrainment?
Entrainment,
Right.
yes.
Would that work also? I mean, would that work also if you were just listening to, like a drum that was in a like a fast paced, or does it only work when it's actual music? Or
Yeah, no, I think it would certainly work, because it's really musical rhythms, and I think so. For example, there's research that looks at the effects of music, and not even related to exercise, just having people lying at resting state. For example, one study, they played fast tempo music and slow tempo music with someone just lying on a table, and they measured their heart rate responses, their arousal levels, and they actually found that the slow tempo music slowed down heart rate, and the fast tempo music actually increased heart rate and arousal levels and responses. So it's incredible how just merely listening to a song could have that kind of an impact.
for sure, but it's also, I think, quite logical in a way. I mean, you do feel calm when you listen to really calm music if you want to relax. And in the same way, like if I I actually do this some mornings. I wake up, and when I have a really hard time getting up, I start like a house song on my phone with my headphones, and then that just turns me, like, the body on, kind of. It's just, I don't know, things happen for sure when I do that. Like this anecdotal story, but still.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also evidence to back that idea up too, which is cool to see. But I think it's quite powerful how music can play with our minds and our bodies, right? And we respond to it accordingly. So, and I've totally been there as well. If I'm hitting a rut in the day, and I need to get up from my desk from working all day and want to get moving a little bit, sometimes throwing on the right song could really help you get that second energy and get that second wind, right? And keep yourself going.
For sure, for sure. But do we, like, is there any hypothesis of why music can have that effect on us?
Yeah, so in terms of like entrainment, are you saying? Or
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, like, from like an evolutionary standpoint.
Mm.
I'm just wondering. I'm just thinking. Like, why it works. It's just because we didn't have music back then. We probably had, or we didn't have music as we have it right now. We probably had music, but it's just interesting why our modern music works and why it can have such an effect on us.
Yeah, and I think again, this is not my expertise per se, but there is definitely research in the music realm that looks at the evolutionary aspects of this too, because music does date back years and years. Obviously where we're at now, the type of music we can listen to, and the sophistication of even things that are synthesized, and sounds that we can use soundboards and things like that. But if you even goes back to your idea of what you mentioned, a drum, right? And that dates back years and years in terms of the impact that in certain cultures that may have drums or ceremonies or things that they would part of their culture traditions. Certainly it's something that's ingrained in us. It's a very innate thing, music, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, I think there's absolutely something there. Again, I'm not as familiar with all the evolutionary aspects, but there's definitely a realm of music research that has tapped into that, and looking at how music impacts us currently based on some evolutionary things over time, and how it's had that innate impact on humans and the way that we live our lives.
For sure. And you mentioned that it could affect the arousal levels, and also that it can affect heart rate. Is there anything else that it seems to be able to affect?
Yeah, and I mean, well, I briefly touched upon it, but one thing we could talk a bit about now is even how it influences the pleasure or displeasure we feel during the exercise and the enjoyment of the exercise.
For sure.
So that plays into, I mentioned there's a combination of psychological and physiological things that are going on, but this probably plays more into the psychological elements of exercise. So again, as I mentioned, when you're looking at lower moderate intensity exercise, this is where we see the most evidence when it comes to creating a more pleasurable experience. Is that music dissociates your attention away from those sort of negative feelings. So if your muscles are sore or you're sweating, and then shifts your focus onto, okay, these are the positive elements of the music. Maybe you're getting really tuned into the lyrics, or whatever part of the song that really gives you a sense of pleasure. And so this can help you experience more pleasure during the exercise. And really this is where, music can permeate affective centers of the brain, such as the amygdala, and elicit some emotional responses and affective responses that are more positive. And so that really helps overall improve the exercise experience. It doesn't feel as displeasurable, and it helps increase that level of pleasure that you're experiencing.
Right, and the pleasure aspect when you listen to music, when you're doing the exercise, is that both low intensity, like moderate intensity, and high intensity?
Great question. So what I'll do, I'll preface this by breaking down the difference between pleasure, or what we call affect or affective responses. So that's sort of just a very fundamental, innate element. It's not, you don't even have time to think about it. It's just, do you experience pleasure or displeasure at a given moment in time?
Right.
And that's sort of where I was alluding to, affective centers of the brain, such as the amygdala, can elicit that. And so these are things. So if I were to prompt you in the middle of an exercise session, how do you feel right now at that very instantaneous moment? That's sort of your affective state, your pleasure or displeasure that you're feeling. Whereas if we look at something like enjoyment, which is often reported by individuals following an exercise session, that is a little bit different. It definitely has an element of the affective experience, but this is different because we have an opportunity to reflect on the experience. So enjoyment incorporates what we would refer to as a cognitive appraisal of the exercise experience. So now you've had time to not just experience it, but to reflect in a way and think about how that made you feel. And so what we find with low and moderate intensity exercise is affect. So that pleasure during the exercise tends to be heightened when listening to music, as well as the enjoyment. But with high intensity exercise, there's less evidence in terms of affect, that pleasure during the task being affected, but there's lots of evidence to show still that the post-exercise enjoyment is quite positive. And again, there's less research in that realm in the high intensity exercise, but I would speculate that this has a lot to do with the fact that, like we mentioned before, it's so hard to dissociate from the negative elements, because you can't ignore that rapid heart rate, those muscles getting sore, things like that. And so in the task, in the moment, it's really hard for music to overwhelmingly make that feel more positive. But when we reflect on the experience, music still helps overall kind of elevate that level of pleasure. Some of the studies have still shown elevated pleasure, some shown significant differences, others not so much, but not as potent when it comes to high intensity exercise.
That's interesting. Just anecdotally, I feel like since I've done I did the interview with Martin Jabala, I've done a couple of, I've actually taken what's it called again? Sprint interval.
Sprint
interval training. Exactly. Sprint. I've started to do that, and when I do that, I always listen to these really, high intensity house music. And for me, at least anecdotally, it feels like it, puts me in a state of, I wouldn't say, I'm not sure exactly what words to use, but I really feel that I have more energy and I feel better when I do the exercise than I would without the music. I'm quite sure of that. But I mean, it's still very exhausting, and it's still, I mean, you can't just take away all the stimuli from your body, but still, I mean, it still feels better, I think, at least for me.
Yeah, and I think that's probably more speaking to the overall experience, right?
Yeah,
because
maybe, yeah.
Like you said, this is you reflecting on that experience, and
Exactly.
I would totally agree that, yeah, and
Yeah.
When you reflect on a sprint interval training protocol that you're completing with or without music, then yeah, certainly I think you'd probably say that you enjoyed the experience more overall when you're listening to music.
Yeah.
But I think it's really neat what you're getting into, taps into this idea that I like to call, I guess, musical energy.
Yeah.
Because I think of it almost as an element of the overall experience of music.
Yeah.
Whether you get sort of generally positive or negative vibe. And I think, if you're looking at house music or electronic dance music, I think of like the beat drop. That's definitely a really good, yeah, right. And it's part of a song that really brings energy to the song.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a really neat concept in the music realm called segmentation.
Yeah.
And this is the idea is that it's the mere anticipation of a segment of music can actually alter arousal and motivational states.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Right. And so I think the beat drop is a great example, because if you're familiar with a song and your song comes on and you're getting ready to do an all out sprint interval bout, the mere anticipation of the beat drop can actually prime you and get you into a more optimal state before you complete that bout, right? And there's actually a really good study by Jasmine Hutchinson and colleagues in 2011, I believe. They did this with a single all-out Wingate anaerobic bout, which is essentially an all-out sprint on a bike. And that's actually, these sprint interval protocols are based on, they're just essentially multiple of these Wingate anaerobic test bouts. But for this study, they used the song "Sandstorm" by Darude.
Yeah.
And if you ever listen to that song, that could definitely get your heart rate going. But they found that to be one of the potential explanations for why they found individuals had that elevated power output during the bouts. And they just listened to I believe for that study, they just listened to the song before the bout and weren't listening to music during the bout.
Right.
So the priming could influence that. I'm not sure if they may have played it throughout the bout for that study. I can't remember, but there are also other studies that have looked at just playing a song before a bout of exercise, and it still is shown to have an impact.
For sure. I mean, it's so hard to know what does what, but I mean, when you're done, for me, I do aerobic exercise first, and then I do resistance training afterwards. And when it's like you get into this state of energy, and not all the time, but sometimes you just get into this state of, I don't know, like mayhem almost, It's like you have like a lot of energy, and you got the music pumping in your ears, and you'll just feel, very aroused, very positive. Like you feel like you can, lift a lot of weights, and I don't know. It's just, I think at least for me, music really has that effect, and I guess that must be different probably from person to person, but yeah, it's interesting.
Totally, and I think what you're describing, it sounds like what I mentioned before, kind of like this flow state in a way.
Yeah.
And again, it's getting you in that kind of optimal mental state, and in a spot where you're just ready to kind of to give it to get gets you going. It gets you in that optimal zone.
Yeah. How does it work? Like, do you have any similar experiences when you do any exercises, or?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I guess one good example I could think of too, and this sort of speaks to also the kind of emotional connection we have with music in terms of a particular context or a particular like for most people, for instance, something like "Eye of the Tiger,"
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That song, right? It
exactly.
makes them think of the movie Rocky, right? For
Yeah,
example, and that could get somebody excited. For me, a good example I like to I always think about is there was a Nike campaign in the 2000s, and the campaign is "My better is better than your better," something like
right,
that.
right.
And there's commercials that came out, and there was one in particular where had some, and I'm a big NBA basketball fan, so
Yeah, yeah.
um, and also not to mention a shout out to the Canadian Steve Nash. Steve Nash and Kevin Durant, and some of these big time superstar players were in the commercial, and there was visuals of them in the video of the commercial of them training intensively. They're sprinting all out. They were doing these complex ladder drills and had parachutes on their backs, running as fast as they could.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and there's a song that was playing during that commercial. It's called "List of Demands" by
Right.
Saul Williams. And every time I hear that song, I just instantly my mind goes to that kind of visual, that imagery. And so for me, I hear that song come on, I want to sprint through the roof, you know?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it's but I think we've all had that experience in some way, shape, or form, whether we can, pinpoint it or not. But that's one for sure on my list that if I'm looking to do some sprinting on a field or something like that, sign me up. I'll put on that song
Yeah, it's so interesting that it can have such a big effect, and also that, I mean, it's also interesting that some songs have kind of when you just feel nothing, kind of, and then just some songs that really push you and really like makes you feel a lot. It's yeah, it's interesting, I think.
Yeah, and I think that in that what you're alluding to is an extremely important point. I think in all this is that when looking at selecting the right music, I think that's a huge factor. Is we can't forget the individual factor, right? Because what you like and what I like might not be the same
For
thing, right?
sure,
And
for
so
sure.
even though I like that song, I hear that song and I think of that commercial and it gets me going. Someone else might hear the song and have not even nearly the same connection that resonates, and they just might not very much dislike it, and that's it, right? So music is very personal in
For
that
sure.
way.
And I think it also might, it can also just strike a chord in people, like, or just can get music can also, I think, be linked to like more deeper fundamental stuff about their life, or something like that as well. I think it's just
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people, someone might be experiencing something in their lives, and during that time period, they are hearing certain songs on the radio, and fast forward several years later, you hear a certain song, and you affiliate it with what was going on in your life at the time,
yeah, yeah.
right? And so that's that emotional element of music that I've been referring to, is that and it could also be maybe there's a song that you listen to with a loved one, and every time you hear that
Yeah,
song come
yeah,
on,
yeah,
you just think of
exactly.
that individual. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. All right, so you mentioned some different stuff. You mentioned that it had an effect on heart rate. You also mentioned that it had an effect on a post-workout enjoyment. And also, but did you say that it also was good for the pleasure aspect also when you were doing these high intensity workout, or what was the results there?
So in terms of a pleasure during the exercise,
Yeah,
there's some mixed evidence there, but generally it could have some sort of an impact. But there's a lot of the research hasn't shown significant
right,
improvements
right.
when comparing. More obvious changes though with enjoyment.
Hmm.
Yeah, but that's not to say that it doesn't have some impact. It's just that, again, there's limited research in that realm, and it's harder to really enhance pleasure when we're looking at more intense exercise.
Yeah, for sure. And how about exhaustion then? Like, or maybe we could get back to perhaps the power output, because I think you mentioned also that the power output of those that listen to music was a bit, or the peak was a bit higher, right?
Yeah. So, and in the studies that I've conducted, we have found that as well, that essentially individuals were able to push a little bit harder and get a little bit more out of their actual work bouts, those high intensity bouts,
right,
and efforts. And then speaking to your point about perceived exhaustion, or what we would refer to as ratings of perceived exertion.
Yeah.
So that's how hard you physically feel that you're working yourself. With, like I mentioned, with low to moderate intensity exercise, people tend to report lower levels of perceived exertion. So even if they're doing the exact same exercise at the same, let's say, moderate intensity level, they actually perceive that their exertion level is lower when they're listening to music. And this seems to be the case generally, but once you get up to intensity levels of about 75% of what we call your VO2 max, or your maximal capacity, which corresponds to about 85% of your maximal heart rate. So once you get to that intensity level, it seems that the effects of RPE, or ratings of perceived exertion, tend to diminish. So essentially, when the exercise gets a little too intense, music doesn't seem to be working as effectively, like we mentioned before. But this also seems to be the case with perceived exertion levels. So up into a certain point, it makes you feel like you're not working as hard.
But you're still working as hard, kind of.
So exactly.
Exactly. So you're working harder, but it doesn't feel like you're working harder.
Well, that is okay. So that's a different point. So,
okay.
So the first one, yes, when you're working at the same relative intensity. So let's say you're going for a jog.
Yeah. And
you're working with and without music, and when you're listening to music, you're at the same intensity, but you feel like you're not working as hard.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But
right.
But what's interesting, you mentioned what you mentioned about if you're working harder, because while for instance, the studies that I've completed, those are more intense. These are people exercising at all-out intensities.
Yeah.
We do find that, yes, people are actually physically working harder, so their output is elevated. But what's interesting is that there's no differences in their perceived exertion level.
Yeah.
Which, so on one hand, researchers might say, well, the effects of exertion are not the same with high intensity. But it could be argued that the fact that they're actually working harder, and rating their exertions to the same degree, one might actually say maybe there is still an effect there, because they should be rating a higher exertion level than they are, right? So
but in your studies, because you've done a couple of different studies, because I've seen that, like in some of your studies, that the average output has been higher, but not in all studies, right? Or
so in one study, for instance, we found that the peak and mean power outputs, and mean power is just the average, like you said, over the course of the whole bout. The peak would be the highest power achieved during a given high intensity bout of exercise within a bigger session. So one study we found that both peak and mean power output were elevated. In another study, we found just the peak power output.
Right.
So the idea might be, for instance, it's possible that motivational music can get people to get a little extra oomph to their work bout, but it might not be sustainable over an extended period of time. I think what's unique about interval exercise, so we talked about the sprint interval training, is that there's rest periods between the bouts. Yeah. And so it's possible that listening to music prior to the bout might be the most impactful time period. Because it's a time where you're pedaling lightly and you're getting
Yeah.
ready for the next workout. So like I said, even this idea of segmentation or the
Right.
anticipation of the
Yeah.
exercise or the
Yeah.
music could kind of ramp you up, psych you up leading into a workout. And then usually the peak power output is achieved within the first few seconds of a bout.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
why it might be that it's the pre-task music that's impactful. And other colleagues of mine, actually, we're currently have a paper with another colleague in the UK, Leighton Jones at Sheffield Hallam University, and the paper that we've been working on, which is currently under review, is we looked at this, what they call respite music, which is essentially music being applied during rest periods in between exercise. And so in the interval protocols, that would mean just playing music during rest periods and not during workouts. Yeah, so we were comparing that versus playing music throughout the entire session, the rest periods and the workouts. And so, yeah, it's quite interesting to see. I think one thing that one of the reasons that that's an interesting question is because of this idea that we're just talking about, that the music during the workout might be a window where we can get people's attention with regards to the music. Whereas during the workouts, you're not going to be able to shift attention or really do too much.
Right. So it's kind of, you use the music during the rest periods to psych you up, and then you just go a bit harder when you're doing that, like when you're actually performing the exercise, and then you go back and you just get yourself psyched again after and then you just
Exactly. And I think that's sort of where this idea of respite music has started to come into play. And I think that's a potential role there for sure. So it's interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Do you know also, I mean, because I know that you're also interested in adherence and exercise adherence. Do you know if music have an effect on adherence in any way, or?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because generally a very understudied area in this realm. Because I think when I look at this, I look at it from a more behavioral lens. Is that is this something that we can use to help people be more likely to engage in activity over time and exercise? So there's been limited evidence generally suggesting that that music may help enhance adherence. Again, it may encourage people to exercise, but overall it's quite understudied. And this is in large part due to the difficulty in setting up a study. So for example, if we look at what we call a randomized controlled trial, where we have people randomized in one condition, let's say for several weeks, they're not listening to music, versus several weeks they're listening to music and exercising, and how that might impact their adherence to exercise.
Yeah,
that's really challenging to do, because it's to eliminate music from people's lives might be very practically challenging, as well as if people are listening to music, how do we standardize the kind of music they're listening to and things like that. So it is also it's more challenging. But I from speaking with colleagues internationally as well, a lot of them have been in conversation, potentially looking at doing some work in the future to try and hone in on this. Again, it's really more of it's a practically challenging thing, but I think it also speaks to the reason why, like I mentioned, one of my more recent studies, we shifted focus towards less active individuals, or those who we said are insufficiently active, not meeting activity guidelines. Because we wanted to see that if music has a potential to positively impact low active people's exercise experiences, it might help promote them to try and do it again in the future in some way, shape, or form.
For sure. I mean, that is from a bigger lens, that really seems to be the most important thing to get people moving, because exercise is pretty much one of the best things you can do for your life. So it's a really good thing.
Exactly. And for that study that I'm referring to, we found that it helped listening to music during these interval protocols helped these insufficiently active people get a bit more out of their workout physically, and they enjoyed it more, which I think is probably the most important when it comes to behavior, because music might be a strategy that people can use to help encourage continued participation. And I think it comes back to the idea of motivation, which plays obviously a large role in whether or not people choose to engage in a particular behavior like exercise, right? So, for example, psychology theories such as self-determination theory can be applied in this context. So based on that theory, motivation can range from being very extrinsic, so outside an individual, to being very intrinsic within the individual. And so if we're looking, for example, more extrinsic external forms of motivation, that could be, if I do a workout today, I'll reward myself with a cheeseburger after, or it could be even if someone has a smartwatch and they want to close their circles, right? So they're exercising to close their circles. It's more extrinsic. That's their motivation for exercising. Whereas what we ideally want to do is shift people to more intrinsic forms of motivation. And for more intrinsic, it's essentially exercising because you inherently enjoy it. And that is really important. You want your motivation to ultimately lie from within the individual. And so one basic hypothesis could be that if music can help people enjoy the exercise more, then it may in turn increase the likelihood of developing an intrinsic level of motivation towards exercise.
Yeah, exactly.
If that makes sense.
Exactly, yeah. If you have a good experience doing the exercise, then it's more likely that you'll probably do it again.
Yes.
Yeah, it really makes sense. But like, it would also be very interesting to know a little bit more about, I mean, you did quite a rigorous process when you chose the songs for one of your last studies. I was thinking, for people who would be interested to get the effects from music, like, what tips do you have to be able to get the most out of your music for your workout?
Yeah, totally. Well, one thing we can talk about is some of the different characteristics of music to look out for.
Sure.
And I'll start off by just acknowledging that obviously with music, it's a combination of really complex musical properties that collectively come together to make it such a unique and powerful stimulus that it is. So, you have things like your beat, your rhythm, the lyrics, the vocals, all kinds of different factors that come into play. But having said that, there are definitely some key characteristics that we can keep in mind, and based on the evidence in the music and exercise literature, and so there's a handful of parameters that I could speak to that possibly your listeners may want to keep in mind when they're putting together a workout.
Sure.
playlist.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sound good? Okay. So one off the top, that's probably one of the more heavily studied, quite a bit of evidence in this area is tempo. And so basically, just to summarize, fast tempo music, so we're looking at around 135 to 140 beats per minute. This seems to be ideal for higher intensity cycling exercise, for example. And then if we're looking at more medium tempo, so that's about 115 to 120 beats per minute.
Yeah.
This may be more ideal for more moderate intensity exercise. And also there's evidence that music any faster than that, I mentioned that fast range of 135 to 140, doesn't seem to matter all that much when it comes to cycling. And I say cycling exercise because those parameters were based on research looking at specifically cycling.
Right.
But if you look at, there's also evidence with regards to treadmill type exercise, ranging from around, saying the ideal range is around 123 to 131. But I say all this, but I should say that it generally would apply to most forms of exercise. That's where we have the most concrete evidence, but of course other modes of exercise would be can be applied that way.
Do you have an example of like 135 to 140, like a well-known song in that area?
Yeah, well, so if you even for the study that I recently mentioned, we actually did alter some of the BPMs a little bit to fall exactly within those ideal ranges.
Right,
But
right.
a song, I believe, yeah. So "Can't Hold Us" by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis featuring Ray Dalton.
Yeah.
That's around 140 beats per minute.
Right.
And that's got a good energy level. And then, for example, a very common tempo for more like electronic dance music would be around 128 beats per minute. The song "Let's Go" by Calvin Harris featuring Neo, that's right around that range. And yeah, so I mean, and I could also, and one of the things I will speak about is genre as well. But what's interesting, like a good example of tempo is famously there's an Ethiopian runner, Haile, I forget, I don't know how to pronounce the last name. Haile, last name starts with a G, hard to pronounce.
Right.
But he famously won an Olympic gold medal by synchronizing his running pace to a song by Scatman.
Right.
Yeah, and broke the 10,000 meter world record. And that's just an example of how tempo can have a role in helping dictate running pace in this example. So that's sort of one characteristic to look out for is tempo. Another thing obviously that's important to keep in mind is what we call epoch. So epoch just essentially refers to the time frame in which a particular song was released. And this really just can impact the cultural relevance of the music, right? So for example, if you're trying to pick a song for someone who's currently in their 20s or 30s to work out to, a song from the 60s might not be most appropriate.
Yeah.
Right.
Makes sense.
First of all, it's likely less familiar, so it's less likely to resonate. And like we talked about, that emotional connection. But also, yeah, a good place to start is, looking at even current charts might be more appropriate for people of that demographic, for example. And that's in part, like I mentioned earlier for our study, when we studied I studied the British music charts at the time and tried to find music that was quite relevant and recent. And what I find really interesting is there's almost this sort of inverted U principle when it comes to the recency of music.
Yeah,
I would say. So what I mean by that, so inverted U, if you picture an upside down U, on one end, on the the early side, there's music's not going to resonate as much if you're less familiar with it.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
But then you listen to it a number of times, you hit a sweet spot where that song is just it's a big thumbs up when it's coming on. But then after you hear it on the radio a million times, you start to get sick of it. And then there's a spot on the other side of the spectrum where you just heard it too many times and it doesn't resonate with you anymore.
For sure.
Right?
For sure.
So
Yeah.
This is an important kind of concept to keep in mind because, again, if you're looking at charts or things like that, if it's a song that's now been overplayed for a month and a half, then it's like, okay, I'm kind of sick of it. And
Exactly.
So just a little tidbit there.
Yeah.
Another key thing to look out for is lyrics. And I think I would suggest, looking for songs that have more empowering lyrics with strong motivational messages. Those can be particularly impactful on a personal level.
Yeah.
And a great example is one of the songs I used in my recent study that I mentioned earlier, "Let's Go" by Calvin Harris featuring Neo. And the lyrics go as follows. They say, "Let's go, make no excuses now. I'm talking here and now. It's all about where you're going, no matter where you've been. Let's go."
Exactly.
Right. So
yeah.
So it really, for a lot of people, these lyrics might give you an urge to get up and start moving. Right. And, we talked about "Eye of the Tiger," for example, and some of the lyrics there. "We will rock you. We are the champions," things like that.
Yeah.
and even other songs in that study, like Can't Hold Us, I mentioned, the idea the ceiling can't hold us. So that makes you feel, okay, you got to break through the ceiling when you're working out or whatnot. And the song Bleed It Out by Linkin Park, the lyrics, digging deeper just to throw it away. So just really these ideas. And again, these are particularly effective for more when you really need that highly motivational type of song.
Yeah.
And so even if the tempo might not be ideal, when you have sometimes empowering lyrics like that, it can be helpful. So that's another one there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So tempo, watch out for, or like look for lyrics that inspires and motivates you, and it's also about now I forgot the third thing you mentioned. Epoch. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Another thing too is that's kind of not necessarily the characteristics, but just sort of general things that kind of bring in different elements. Is one is genre, right? And we were talking about, for example, house music or electronic or dance music. They actually generally tend to have faster tempos. From around 120, 140 beats per minute. So right off the top, that genre generally tends to bode well for, let's say, moderate to high intensity exercise. What's interesting is other genres like hip hop or rap tend to have slower tempos.
Yeah.
So those are usually around 60 to 100 beats per minute.
Yeah.
But having said that, so if someone's really likes hip hop and rap music, then they might say, oh well, 60 to 100 beats per minute, that's not the ideal tempo range. I should not listen to that music when I exercise. Well, I personally would say that's definitely not the case, because I think, again, that's where that personal aspect comes into play as well. But what's interesting is if we talk about this idea of energy, right? Musical energy, and I think that's super important. And so when it comes to something like hip hop or rap music, it's actually, I tend to find that songs, even though the tempos are slow, they have the right energy for the exercise. That, if especially I find really effective for resistance training and strength training. And so, for example, rappers actually, they use a technique called double time, where the tempo of the song might be slower, but the rapper actually speeds up the rate of rapping to be twice as fast as the BPMs of the song. So it actually, although the tempo is slower, the perception of the song is a little bit faster than that, and the energy is a little bit higher overall, right? So if you've ever noticed that, have you ever heard of the artist Logic?
Actually, not on top of my mind, no, but go ahead.
Okay. So he's a good example because he tends to do that double time type of rap, and recently had an album where they used so it's called boom bap. It's sort of a popular 90s hip hop style where they use a combination of bass drums and snare drums, but in a lot of songs had that style, and although the tempo might not have been necessarily as fast in certain songs, because he's rapping at a certain pace, that actually brings the energy level up. And so songs like that could kind of get you going. A good example, I think it's called 100 Miles and Running, is just a good example by Logic in that album I mentioned, where that style of rap keeps the energy up.
Right. And it must also be, I guess, important also, as you mentioned before, your personal interest and just listen to a song and just seeing how that makes you feel and what happens when you listen to some typical song as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, while certain musical properties can be carefully selected for and standardized based on a certain type of exercise, so whether it be like the things we talked about, tempo, lyrics, epoch, you can never truly account for the individual variability in response to music. And so it's so important to consider the individual meaning that someone might place on a particular song. And that, again, it might be very different from one individual to another. And another way of putting that is the self-selection of music is very important. So keeping your own personal interests in mind. definitely helpful to use these characteristics as general guidelines, right? So you don't want to necessarily have extremely slow tempo, slow song when you're doing an all-out type of high-intensity exercise. This might not be overly appropriate, but yeah, ultimately you gotta go with what works for you, and your personal preference is, it's still fundamental to ensuring that music has that emotional response at an individual level.
For sure, for sure. I was also thinking about, like, for people that don't use music as much or don't get as motivated by the music when they are exercising, or perhaps would like to find better music that motivates them better. Do you have any tips of like how to put together, like a good motivational playlist, or how to go about finding music that is better when it comes to motivation for exercise?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can go online and try and find some things. There are resources. My colleague, Kostas Karageorgis at Brunel University, often even tweets out or publishes some like recommended playlists that people can use for different types of activity,
right?
Which is certainly an option. But I also think, not everyone, I shouldn't say, but a lot of people are now tuned into things like Spotify or Apple Music.
Yeah, for sure.
And honestly, those tend to be pretty strong resources or easy resources accessible for finding the right playlist as well. So you could even, on Spotify, you can just look up, if you're doing, let's say you want to do a strength workout, you look up, strength training playlist.
True.
Or if you're doing something high intensity, or if you're going for a run, there's all kinds of content available. And I'm sure, I'm not necessarily that individuals who put the playlist together were specifically seeking out the characteristics we talked about, but a lot of them, I'm sure, would fall into those categories. I even personally, if I'm kind of looking for something new, I'll sometimes I have Apple Music, and I'll look for some playlists, and I'll listen to a song. If it resonates with me, if it hits the right chords, like you said, if it has the right characteristics, then I'll tend to add that to my own playlist, and integrate it. It's just a good starting point, at very least, to start picking and choosing what you like.
Exactly. And if you like a song, you just add it to your own playlist, and then you just keep on growing on your own playlist.
It. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I use YouTube myself. I used Spotify before, but then I really like YouTube because it has a lot of these 60-minute mixes. So I also search for like aerobic exercise music from the start. But now I just found a really good artist called Daveepa, Daveepa, and I just love. Okay. I've listened to like all his 60-minute mixes.
There you go.
So I guess you just find whatever you like. You find whatever resonates, and then keep on listening to that kind of.
Whatever gets the people going, right? That's what it is. So.
Maybe we should put up speakers inside the cities, and you just pump out, fast-paced music with the best genre,
Everyone will start running around everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you and me would get arrested. But anyways, right. I would like to just touch on before we head off. I know that you've been a strength and conditioning coach as well, working with athletes. I know that we don't have as much time, but it would just be interesting to know a little bit about your experience there. Maybe you could just give, if you have any tips for us normal people exercising, if you have any tips for performance or for getting it done or sticking to the schedule that you assign to yourself or whatever. If you have any good tips on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing to keep in mind always with exercise and training and anything like that is there's just not one cookie cutter approach that works for everyone, right? And it's really important to acknowledge. So really, if you want to determine or get to the point where you have an optimal or best workout regimen for yourself, it takes some trial and error, and it definitely largely depends on an individual. That being said, that's, don't be shy of trying different things as you go through. But yeah, there's certainly some very important things that I could speak to that, off the top, that are always good to keep in mind when you're, looking to achieve your goals. And so actually that's the very first one is, what are your exercise goals? Establishing what it is that you're after. I think that's probably the starting point, right? Because, are you a more elite level athlete that's looking to, train for a particular competition, or are you someone who's just starting off and you just simply want to exercise to improve your health, maybe it's your goals are to lose weight or to increase strength. So that is so important because that will also dictate what you're going to do moving forward in terms of your workouts and your exercise.
Right, for sure.
So I think one motto I like to speak to in that realm is this idea of train with a purpose, right?
Yeah.
And so always have that bigger picture in mind. Think about, what are your ultimate training goals? What is your body telling you? Are you feeling very sore and tired and fatigued? Do you need to do something, ease off a little bit today? Things like that. But I just think it's important that you come into a given workout with at least a general understanding for what you'd like to accomplish that day.
Yeah.
And I think it changes, right? It's going to be different from one day, 1 week, 1 month to the next. So important to keep that in mind. And training smart, right? Because, for instance, if you're looking to make some strength gains, right, and you want to isolate and move heavier weight, it doesn't make as much sense to burn yourself out and do repetitions to fatigue, for example. That's a different type of training we call hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So again, just having these things in mind when you're going through. And I think it's also important to consider what kind of activities that you normally do or what you enjoy doing, because it's always nice to build off of the things that you like and that you're comfortable with. But then, of course, there comes a point in time where you need to eventually get into a little bit of potentially discomfort, and that's where a lot of the times where you can make some gains. So even some specific examples of things that people can try doing on their own, just to even to start being active or to stick with it. Like I mentioned, goal setting is a really good one. So knowing what your goals are, setting your goals, monitoring your goals. So we call it self-monitoring. So keeping track of it over time and your progress. And even this, and an important one is this idea of like coping planning. So along the way, you're gonna face some barriers. So it's important to be prepared for that. So one specific example would be a strategy called implementation intentions. And so this is really simply coming up with what we call if-then statements. So you say to yourself, if X happens, then Y, I'll do Y. So one example would be, let's say your goals are to improve your cardiovascular fitness and you want to get into running more. So you plan to run outside X number of times a week. If, for example, so you have your if-then statement is, if I plan to go running outside, then and it's raining outside and I can't do that, then having that backup plan. So then would be, I will follow a YouTube workout class instead and stay inside at home. So having a plan in mind when things come up, when barriers arise. And then one other kind of in that realm, what we generally call behavior change techniques is biofeedback is an important one as well. So it's really relevant right now, especially with quite a resurgence in smartwatches, for example, where you can get a lot of real-time biofeedback. So that could be your heart rate responses, for example. So you're getting feedback on the intensity of your workout. And these things can be very helpful in monitoring your exercise, monitoring, am I working hard enough? Am I working too hard? Things like that. And that helps keeping you going over time.
For sure. That's there are some really helpful tips. I think it would be interesting to go more in depth, perhaps some other time, to learn some more about all that stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one other sort of just a general thing that I think is important to keep in mind is what I like to call this idea of break to build.
Yeah.
And a lot of people might not really think about this, but really it's a simple understanding that when you exercise, your muscles, your body, you're physically breaking down, right?
Yeah.
So, micro muscle fiber tears are occurring when you're, working out, you're depleting energy stores. And it's really what happens after you exercise or you're training that leads to the gains.
Right.
And so this really means that it's so important that you provide your mind and body with proper nutrition and recovery in order to build yourself stronger. Because otherwise, the workouts that you're doing are you're not going to make those adaptations over time if you just put your body under stress and then don't follow it up with proper nutrition and recovery. So that's just another thing that I think is fundamental, and it's something that everyone can keep in mind as they're trying to make some improvements to their physical health.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's I'm just getting all these ideas now into my head, but I know that there's some other things we have to, or no,
always lots to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. Right, but if somebody would like to find your work or like find you on social media or a web page, do you have in some place where people can find you and your work?
Yeah, I mean online, you could always look up my name online, Matthew Stork.
Yeah.
I have a Twitter. It's at Matt J Stork. So MattJStork. Yeah, I have on that's probably the best in terms of Twitter, and then Google Scholar accounts and things like that. But you can just look up my name if you're looking to dive into some of the research and whatnot.
Great. And I was also wondering about perhaps the music aspect when it comes to, or music for exercise. Do you have any tips on, books or web pages or YouTube accounts or whatever that you would suggest for somebody who would like to learn more about these things?
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned my colleague Kostas Karageorgis, who is I would say a world leader in the area of music and exercise, and I would recommend you can check out his Twitter account because he often will tweet out infographics and things like that, and playlists and things that are very practical. And his Twitter handle is, I believe, it's SAVI Brunel, BRUNEL. So it's at Savvy Brunel.
Yeah.
And that's the research group there, their Twitter handle. And he actually has a really great book that's pretty applicable and is, anybody could probably follow along and read. It's called Applying Music in Exercise and Sport.
Right.
And it's a really great resource. I have a copy actually sitting over here on my desk.
Nice.
So it's a great resource if people are interested in diving deeper into the world of music and exercise and sport.
Ah, cool. All right. Well, Matt, it's been really, really fun talking to you. I'm really, really glad that I had you on. And yeah, I mean, music is something that all of us really use, and if you can use music to get more people active, it's a really important thing. So great work, and thank you for coming on to share all your knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. It's been fun.
All right, take care.
All right, you too.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Friends, I really need your help. I'm trying to get the podcast out there. So I was wondering if you could help me by leaving a positive rating and a review on your Apple device or the podcast player that you're using, as well as subscribing to the podcast. That really helps getting the show more visible on iTunes and other players. And if you don't know how it's done, then YouTube has a lot of great videos, so you can search there. All right, that's it. Take care. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, including the giving of medical advice. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.